Please join me in welcoming Tariq Ali.
Thanks, Iftikhar, and thanks to Hoor, who organized this Biennale and persuaded me to come. Not that I needed all that much persuasion. Very happy to be in Lahore again. Always a slightly emotional thing, since one was born, brought up, and spent the first 20 years of my life in this city. And since I've been asked to speak about decolonization processes and solidarity, I think it's worth starting off with. As I was driving down the Mall to this event, passing the Lahore High Court, where many awful things took place historically, but I was also recalled of an event which showed the solidarity of the students of this city many, many years ago, in 1961, when we marched, organized a students' assembly the day the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first elected Prime Minister of the Congo, was announced. We called a public meeting, a students' meeting, under a very enlightened principal, Dr. Nazir Ahmed. And he left the meeting very rapidly after he saw the tenor of what was going on. But we marched down the streets when demonstrations were forbidden, but it was martial law, to the American consulate to deliver a protest against the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. That was in Lahore, a very internationalist city, historically, by the way, but also which had a population at that time, soon after independence, not many years after independence, and a student population that was interested in the rest of the world. Otherwise, you can't explain how we persuaded 500 to 600 people to come out onto the streets for someone they had barely heard of, an African liberation leader, Patrice Lumumba, who had been killed. And I often run into people. We more or less knew everyone on that demonstration because they were all from government college. But I still run into people, different parts of the world from Lahore, who say, yeah, do you remember the Lumumba demonstration? And I'm half sure that the person saying it was never on the demonstration. Because they're usually senior civil servants and sometimes worse. But anyway, so I want to start off, if we are talking about how the world has changed. It's a different world we live in today. And this world is a world both of transition and a world in which there are a great number of morbid symptoms on virtually every continent. And these morbid symptoms have the tendency to destroy hope and to encourage despair. So whenever anything happens that is hopeful, one is happy again, that something is going on, there is some movement. When the students came out in Chile recently, in South America, a country that was blighted by years of brutal military dictatorship, and demonstrated continuously for several months and won some of their demands, it's not a huge victory on a global scale, but it's positive. When students in Iraq, occupied since 2003, came out several months ago and started demonstrating against the corruptions of their government, a government put into place by the United States after they toppled the local ruler, not one of my heroes, but it's not for the United States to topple governments. That one felt hope because a lot of the demonstrators in Baghdad and in Basra were both Sunni and Shia. So this attempt, very deliberate, careful attempt to sectarianize the Islamic world, you felt was being challenged, even if semi-consciously, by the large numbers of students who came out onto the streets in Baghdad, demanding accountability, demanding more democracy, demanding an end to corruption, and demanding that all foreign troops leave the country. So these things keep on going, and in different parts of the world. And I will also like to mention now the big movement that has erupted in India, our neighboring country, and for us extremely important, for those of us who live here. What happens there is not something that can be ignored. So you had two big events in India. One was the decision by the Indian government, a semi-fascist government, but elected, which proves that sometimes people elect governments not knowing exactly how they're going to turn out to be, and these governments then go beyond what was expected or not expected of them. And the assault on Kashmir and the rights of the Kashmiri people has been horrific. Truly horrific. Large numbers of people arrested, people killed, all contact with Kashmir cut off, so that Kashmiris living in the diaspora have no way of contacting their relations. And the people being targeted, most of the time, are young men. Captured, picked up, taken off the streets, put in concentration camps. This event, not so well reported, has not created all that much solidarity. Now, I've been appealing for years to friends in India, saying you cannot ignore what is happening there. But they're nervous. And why are even good people nervous in India about talking about Kashmir? Because to talk about Kashmir, you are automatically accused of threatening the security of the Indian state, because this is a contentious issue linked to Pakistan and 3 wars that have taken place. So elementary display of solidarity with people being crushed, their rights being taken away, the Indian constitution being changed, is considered something too dangerous to do. And some of us warned them that if you don't defend the right of the Kashmiris, what will you do when they come for you? And we said this, I said this in a public statement addressed to India's great Bollywood stars, the ones who are Muslims, and who speak up for many things but never ever mention Kashmir, because they're scared. That's the honest truth. So I said, when are you going to speak up for the Kashmiris? Because this government, this Modi government, will come after you. And that is now what is happening with the attempt to create a climate of fear in India. Indian Muslims, even the very wealthy ones, are nervous and do not know what the future holds. And this right to deny any Muslim refugees any status in India at all, or to allow them to come in, has at long last created a movement which has united lots of progressive people who have been marching in the streets, primarily students, but not exclusively students. There was a huge march in Hyderabad 2 weeks ago with people marching, old and young, and the banner they carried was, "Thank you, Modi, for uniting Hindus and Muslims." But, I mean, it's an ironic banner, but the question, that there is an element of truth in it, because the divide within that country on the level of religion and caste is horrendous, truly horrendous. And so there's some movement, and for the first time, Modi's popularity is declining. And the point I'm making here is that what produces that is a combination of solidarity with the oppressed, and action, activity on the streets. Historically, that has been the way to bring about a turnaround. And the situation in Iraq, the situation in Lebanon, where demonstrations are still going on. They are hardly reported, but they're going on, I hear from Lebanese friends. And the big demand in Lebanon is enough. All our politicians are corrupt. Let's do something about it. It's difficult for them to do something about it unless there's an alternative political movement, but still, it expresses an anger which shows that the new generations that are coming up are not going to take things lying down. They may be repressed, they may be locked up, but they will also carry on. But the big difference on a structural level in the world we live in today is that we have one dominant nation, the United States of America, which gets away with doing whatever it wants to do, whether it does it openly or surreptitiously. The one advantage of Trump is that he's quite open about what he's going to do. And so the gangster talk that emanates from the White House is nothing new, but in the past it was always covered up with, veils, different veils, trying to conceal the reality underneath. It was for human rights, it was for this, it was for that, when the struggles since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the turn in China has been how to maintain American hegemony in a world which is no longer divided by ideology or by countervailing ideologies. How do you do it? And the Americans have finally come down and said, we will do it in any way we want, and if necessary, where it's necessary and we consider it necessary, we'll do it by force. So a single event is blown out of all proportion. One mercenary working for the US Army on an American base in Iraq is shot killed during a drone raid. He's not even a US citizen, I'm told, but we'll see when that is confirmed or not. And they want revenge. And the CIA always has a list of things they can do, from the lowest possible response to the highest possible response. And the Pentagon and the CIA are telling insiders that we did not put General Soleimani's name on that list. We didn't do it. It was someone else, the reference is Israel, obviously. Mossad put him on the list. Well, we don't know. Honestly, I can't say whether this is true or not. But the name was put on the list. It was the sort of worst thing they could do, and they did it. And the American president, speaking in gangster language, says, we thought about taking him out some months ago, and we sent warnings, but they wouldn't listen, so we took him out. We took him out. I.e., the state as terrorist. The state decides we have to take him out, and not everyone in the state, but the top person running that state, and they take him out. Now, what they don't understand, or they don't like to understand, or they don't say it in public, is you behave like this, and what right do you have to tell non-state actors don't behave like that? You have no right at all, and even if you think you have the rights and you'll kill everyone who opposes you, people will start doing the same. That will be the effect of this public execution of the Iranian general. Add to this, militarily they do this. Economically, they institute a trade war with China, which is not an intelligent thing to do, but it shows the strength of the United States. Just as a footnote, I get very fed up when I read reports and articles in Western magazines and elsewhere, sometimes leftist magazines, saying the United States is finished. It's not true. It's wishful thinking. It is not finished. It is far from being finished. It uses its military strength to buttress itself economically, and increasingly it's been using its economic muscle to impose sanctions, economic sanctions on countries it doesn't like. And the trade war with China is a huge thing. And that the Chinese have signed this trade deal is actually an act of capitulation. What the Americans have said, we want $200 billion from you, more from you than you've been paying so far, which means you have to buy American goods. Now, in order to do that, the Chinese have to stop buying goods from countries in Africa, their neighbors in Asia, Europe, in order to spend that $200 billion on US goods. And no one thought they would do it, but they did it. They did it. And that indicates that they realize that a price might have to be paid, which no one can even think of what it would be had they said, no, we're going to carry on as we are. So the one country which is considered by many people in the world as a powerful counterbalance to the United States is not a counterbalance politically, ideologically, militarily. Economically, it is a counterbalance, but even on that front, the United States are now putting on the pressure. And then we look at what has happened in the Middle East since 9/11. I mean, any observer, regardless of what their political views are, were, has been, or might be, has to recognize the following facts. That the systematic destruction of one country after the other could not have happened had the United States not taken the decision to do so. Sometimes there are unintended consequences. They're threatening Iran now. Why? Because Iran, they feel, is too powerful a regional player in Iraq. But how did Iran become such a key regional player and strong in Iraq? Is because they invaded Iraq in 2003 and gave power to the Shia clerical parties. And the Iranians, who defend their own national interests, and I am opposed to anyone invading them, by the way, but one has to say that they act largely in their own interests, national interests. There's no overarching solidarity. And they backed the war in Iraq. And they backed, for their own reasons, because Saddam was an enemy, he'd waged war against them, backed by the West, millions killed. So for that reason, they backed the war to get rid of one enemy, and another enemy they had, and for understandable reasons, was the Taliban and the regime in Kabul. So they backed the Americans when they took over Kabul after 9/11. But they also used this period, and they thought wrongly that because we've helped the Americans out, they'll do a deal with us. Well, the Americans don't want to do a deal with them. So the Middle East has been wrecked because of the lack of any clarity or understanding at all by the United States about what actually they want apart from helping Israel. And if you look at it globally, the way the United States is asserting its hegemony is by reducing the sovereignty of those countries in the world who could be a challenge. So Iraq was a sovereign state. They felt its very existence threatened the Israelis, destroy it. Libya, for all its eccentricities, was also a sovereign state, destroyed. Cut it up into 3 bits. 3 nightmarish organizations are now controlling this country. The Americans are still in Iraq. 3 wars against Iraq. The Gulf War, the war of sanctions, in which 750,000 children died because of lack of medical aid, and the 3rd war of 2003. So 3 wars against Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the nightmare in Syria, And the aim is to create little Bantustans, little statelets in these countries so that these countries become easier to run. So my advice these days for those aspiring to create tiny states is don't do it. And even with the Kurdish leadership, I've had many, many arguments saying the Americans are not going to give you an independent state. They will not do it. It's not in their interests. So don't imagine you'll get anything and collaborate as you've been doing. Now they're coming around to that conclusion. And the other thing they forget, very close Kurdish friends of mine, is that a minority of Kurds live in the mountains. Half of Istanbul, if not more than half, is a Kurdish city. There are intermarriages. The same we can say about Baghdad. Huge Kurdish population. High number of intermarriages. For a long time, nothing sort of that dramatic recently. So all this has got to be taken into account. I mean, the one footnote I'll make on that is that there's a large Pashtun population in Karachi, which one shouldn't forget. So anything done in the region itself has to bear that in mind. So in this world, to depend on state powers for solidarity when state powers essentially act in their own interests, whether it's the United States or China or Iran or whoever, by and large, there are very few states, if any. I mean, Cuba is a small island, who act in the interests of international solidarity. The one thing that has happened recently, quite interesting, both to a certain extent in parts of the Arab world and certainly in India, which it's a sort of cultural, is poetry is having a big revival again. The students of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, probably the best postgraduate institution in the whole of South Asia, attacked by government thugs, hooligans sent in by the Modi party to attack Muslim kids, radical kids, left-wing kids, the CPM, burn it. And what do the students do? At their big solidarity meeting, a group of students take the platform and sing Faiz's Hum Dekhenge. Very moving. Just watch it on YouTube. The JNU students singing Faiz. Same was done in Jamia Millia in Delhi and in other parts. So in its own way, poetry brings an internationalism. And even poetry which is not sung by great stars, which is the way it usually becomes very popular, but recited by students, is taking the stage. And I remember fully now that it's just come to me, this memory, that the day the US started bombing Baghdad and Iraq, I was in London with an Iraqi poet, Sadi Yousaf, and he said, they're bombing us again, they're recolonizing us, God knows what's going to happen to my country. And we spent that whole day consuming liquids that are banned in most parts of the Muslim world, just out of sadness. And he had written a poem the week before, because a meeting had taken place in London with Iraqi collaborationists to discuss the future of Iraq with all this, proto-colonial officials from the British Foreign Office, some Americans, everyone, what is the future of Iraq? And the two great exiled poets of Iraq, Sadi Yousaf in Baghdad and Muzaffar al-Nawab in Damascus in exile, corresponded through poetry. And I just remembered the poem he recited to me that day. Sadi Yusuf. A poem he sent, the opening line is, "What are we going to do, O Muzaffar al-Nawab?" And the poem is called A Jackal's Wedding. Now, in our culture here, a jackal's wedding has sort of weird connotations, but not the same in the Arab world. Here the connotations are when the sun shines and the rain comes on the same day. You say it must be a jackal's wedding. To be frank, I've never fully understood this, why this is so. I mean, what has a sunny day with rain coming down got to do with a jackal's wedding? But in the Iraqi culture, they're very clear that what a jackal's wedding means. And Muzaffar al-Nawab explained it to me. He said, in the summer in Basra, where I come from, we all sleep in the open. And the noise the jackals make when they are mating and fighting each other and leaving a stench behind wakes everyone up and leaves an awful smell in the air. So whenever the event is really bad, we call it a jackal's wedding. So, referring to this conference in London, Sadi Yusuf writes to Muzaffar al-Nawab, "What are we to do about the jackal's wedding, Muzaffar al-Nawab? You remember the old days, in the cool of the evening under a bamboo roof, propped on soft cushions, stuffed with fine wool, we'd sip tea. A tea I've never since tasted among friends. Then a cackling explodes from the long grass and the date palms, the jackal's wedding. Today isn't yesterday. Truth is as evanescent as the dream of a child. Truth is, this time we are at their wedding reception. Yes, the jackal's wedding. You've read the invitation." He's referring to the London conference. "I'll go in your place. Damascus is too far away from that secret hotel. I'll spit in the jackals' faces. I'll spit on their lists. I'll declare that we are the people of Iraq. We are the ancestral trees of this land, proud beneath our modest roof of bamboo." And Sadi Yusuf said, I sent this poem to him, and because of the technology that now exists, it was emailed. That same day I sent it to Muzaffar. It was emailed and was being read in the cafes in Basra. That is new, this ability to communicate. And this has been made possible, and we should be very open about this, especially to those who talk permanently of American decline, is that the web, the World Wide Web, was not invented anywhere else in the world but on the west coast of the United States, which has transformed many things economically, not for the better, but it's transformed them, and in terms of grassroots level communication. And states are now learning how to deal with it by just banning it, as they've done in Kashmir. Cut off the internet so people can't communicate with each other. So, in this situation, solidarity, information has been made much easier, but also more difficult, because from there, from informing other people to actually organizing, is not an easy thing to do. And at the top of this pyramid, and at the bottom, is the United States. Very strong, very powerful. And the young people marching on anti-capitalist demonstrations, or from Bernie Sanders in the United States, I always support them and wish them well, but it's not going to be very easy. Because the other thing is that one of the things that remains unpredictable in this world, largely because how the world has changed and how the world has developed, is nature. Not just climate change, but nature. Catastrophes which have taken place, from Chernobyl to the Australian bushfires, to the ravaging and looting of the Amazon. And the scale of this potential threat to the stability of the system is now generally conceded. The proximity of different dangers is less clear-cut. We don't know exactly what's going to happen or where, but it creates this uncertainty. And so the Extinction Rebellion people who are marching for change, for doing something, are incredibly courageous. They may not have all the answers, but then who does? They want governments to set up and listen and notice to what's happening to the environment and to the planet. But the fact of the matter is that to do anything serious, as Naomi Klein has argued in her last work, you have to have planning on a global level. Regardless of whether you're capitalist or whatever, the only way to change course is for planning. And the very word planning is anathema to most of the people who run the world, but they know it. That something like that has to happen. Because manifestly, a system-wide shock capable of altering all calculations of the future is a possibility. We just have to accept that. Ecological catastrophes of planetary scope, now increasingly feared, have so far failed to bring countries and states together in any common preventive programs. Capitalism, united against labor, remains divided against nature, as rival businesses and governments attempt to shift the costs onto someone else, not seeing, not accepting it as part of the reality. Then there is talk, increasing talk of automation. Now, quite honestly, for me, this talk is either reactionary or on some levels utopian. It's not the case that technological changes can end labor as we know it. There are many, many things that robots cannot do. I mean, I grant that in many parts of the world, robots could become politicians. You could have party robot A, party robot B, standing for slightly different things, coming into a parliament, debating, being voted on. Difficult to do in Pakistan because our politicians are too original for the robot. But nonetheless, and in some other countries, not just Pakistan, there are politicians who surprise. I mean, Trump, for instance. It'd be difficult to think of a robot who could play him. But by and large, a robotic future can happen on some levels, but if it happens once again without any planning, there will be misery on a grand scale. So we have a world elite meeting at Davos, making nice promises, but basically having no answer at all to the problems that face them, which aren't faced by any challenges from below, but are created by the world in which we live and the degree to which this world has developed. That is the scale, and for that you need visionary politicians. And this is the one thing that is very seriously lacking in most parts of the world. That the politicians, right, left, center, far left, far right, whatever you want, whichever direction you go in, there are very few visionaries. And it's in this vacuum that you see movements rising and falling, Occupy movement in the United States, the Arab Spring. I mean, Egyptian friends who were very excited by the Arab Spring, I remember saying it's wonderful, but ultimately it's politics that will determine the future. And if you don't have any politics, it will be the Brotherhood that will supply it. There's no third force. And that's exactly what happens. So, to many young people here, I don't want you to feel depressed or pessimistic. It's just a question of being realistic and understanding the world in which we live, the scale of the problems which we face. And it's not that they can't be solved, but they can only be solved is if the quality of leadership on a global scale, or at least in 7 or 8 key countries, changes, shifts, and this, what we've experienced over the last 30 years, neoliberalism in the realm of economy and continuous wars. I mean, just think about it. The war in Iraq, the war in the Middle East, and the war in Afghanistan have now carried on longer than the First and Second World Wars combined, which traumatized Europe. The wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan have been going on much longer, and it's conjecture as to what effect they're going to have, because people living under wars do get traumatized. It's not just politics and ideology, it's psychological. There's a trauma growing up non-stop under a war when there's nothing you can identify with particularly. So I feel we have to carry on, of course, that struggles will not cease. But ultimately, the many old questions from the last century that remained unanswered. I mean, when you think back now, the idea at the height of Arab nationalism during Nasser's time of a unified Arab republic, who discusses that seriously? No one. Very few people. Palestine has virtually been wiped out as an entity in the face of the entire world. Who thinks about that? I mean, the people crushing them think about nothing else, the Israelis. But in terms of solidarity, very little. There is great sympathy for the Palestinians in the Arab world, but solidarity, no. In Europe, no. They said that the Palestinians are terrorists when the Palestinians set up a perfectly legitimate, non-violent movement calling for boycotts, divestment, sanctions, the BDS. This is being illegalized. You can't speak in favor of it on campuses in many parts of the Western world. You can't do it. So violence is impermissible, non-violence is impermissible. So what the hell are people going to do? I mean, you push them in the direction of individual solutions, of carrying out individual acts. And these don't always work. But that is the direction the world and individuals in it are being pushed into. So I'd like to end by offering solidarity to all the people who are still carrying on, the Shia and Sunni in Iraq who want a genuinely independent Iraq, to the Lebanese students who don't like corruption, to the Palestinians facing torture, killings every single day at the hands of the Israelis, to the students fighting and others fighting for elementary rights. Suddenly something happens to get rid of a dictatorship, like in Sudan. And we are all pleasantly surprised, and we're even more surprised and happier that some of the people who led that movement were Sudanese women in the forefront of that struggle. So these things will carry on happening. Of that I'm sure. In the meantime, those who run the world, who develop its system, who say nothing structurally is wrong, they're the ones effectively leading us to disaster. That's all.
So we will have a question and answer session with Tariq Ali, and which will be followed then by the next panel. But we'll pause for a couple of minutes for those people who want to leave they can please leave, and we'll continue with the question and answer.
Against the Jewish people and Zionism, but the Jewish people and the Zionists don't seem to realize that it's their actions which are causing this feeling, this anger. At least I feel this is it. What can be done about it? They don't seem to realize.
Well,
At least I feel. Maybe I'm wrong.
well, there is anger against the Israeli government, and there is anger against the Zionists who are part and parcel of that government and have been since 1948. There isn't anger against the Jewish people as such, and many, many Jewish people in different parts of the world actually are supporters of the Palestinian cause and the BDS and hate being identified with the Israeli government. And that's the same as many people, in other parts of the world don't particularly like being identified with their governments, whether they're religious or non-religious or whatever. So it's the same there. And as I said in my talk, the best way to help the Palestinians is to do what their most enlightened leaders have called for and join the BDS campaigns and the movement for boycott. That's the only thing we can do, and it's effective. And it's been even more effective. I mean, the interesting thing is that in South Africa, trade union delegations, government delegations have visited Palestine and have come back and said the situation the Palestinians face is much worse than we black people had to face under apartheid. Because had the apartheid regime done to us every day what is happening to the Palestinians, there would have been a civil war. And the South African government is one of the few governments which is giving a lot of support and backing to the Palestinians, and many of its cities are part of the BDS campaign. That is happening in different parts of the world, but South Africa is the strongest on that, and there are good reasons for it.
Tariq, I'd like you to comment on Iran and its position in the Middle East and in relation to Pakistan, and what is going to happen. What do you think is going to happen in the near future?
Well, as I said, I think what the United States did in executing an Iranian general in public should make all generals who work with the United States and have worked with them nervous, not just in Iran, but that this is what they're capable of doing, and once you've served their needs, they can, they feel you're enough of a threat, they can get rid of you. To the larger question, whether the United States will wage war on Iran, my position on this has been for the last 10, 20 years now that it's very unlikely that they would try and regime change in Iran, that they would actually try and do in Iraq what they did in Iraq and Iran, because the situation is different. And though there is an opposition to the regime in Iran, it's not a regime which is unopposed, as we see from time to time, and not just by students or middle-class intellectuals, but actually by working people. When they feel conditions have got worse, they come out onto the streets and protest or go on strike. So, but none of them want to be attacked or invaded by the United States. They don't want that, and the Americans know that. So what they will do is maintain sanctions, maintain pressure. They've now Trump's government ended all attempts to have a nuclear deal with the Iranians, and the Iranians have now said, okay, that's it. We will do what we have to do. And you know, this is a sort of touchy question, but it just is a fact that countries which have nuclear weapons are countries which are hardly ever attacked. Not just big countries. If you look at North Korea, I mean, one day North Korea and the and the United States, their leaders are exchanging the most vicious insults with each other in public and tweeting the world as to what each thinks of the other, and it's incredibly vicious. The next day they're sitting down and talking about how to do a deal on North Korea's nuclear weapons. So the Iranians would be prepared to do a deal, but there's always been a current in Iran which says, why should we? I mean, our civilians have been killed and knocked down. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, India has nuclear weapons, China has nuclear weapons, Israel has nuclear weapons. So which God has ordained that we can't have them? And the Israeli nuclear capacities are never discussed in public because officially it's not recognized that they have nuclear weapons, but of course the whole world knows. Which is why it's a complete joke for the Israelis to pretend that they are the weak part threatened by these evil Arabs and Muslims, because no one is going to challenge Israel. Leaving aside it's got the 7th largest army in the world, it's got nuclear weapons. No one is directly interested in attacking them either. So the Iranians might go in that direction just as a defensive measure to prevent any attacks. The United States, I think, will carry on upping the pressure because the big demand comes from the Israelis to do something about Iran. I mean, the day Baghdad fell, the Israeli ambassador, quoted on the front page of the New York Times, said, "Congratulations to the United States, now let's finish the job. Onward to Damascus and Tehran." And the reason is not that these are countries with huge armaments, but they have a certain degree of sovereignty. That was the feeling. And Iran still remains a sovereign state. It isn't, linked to any other power bloc. So I think the pressure will continue, but no direct attack. This has been my reading of the situation. And even when Trump ordered the killing of this Iranian general, the Pentagon let it be known via its journalists' friends who they trust with information that this was not something we backed. That's what the Pentagon said. So there's a division in that ruling establishment itself. But you can never tell, but that is my reading of it, that they will keep the pressure up, they will try and weaken Iran as they do in the Yemen war, which is one of the most unpleasant of recent wars in the Middle East, but they will not try and directly attack the country.
Sir, my question.
Yeah.
What do you feel the new social movements growing, the youth movement particularly, perhaps the student movement, particularly in Pakistan, India, Chile, which basically may be an indication of a new social contract. So what do you feel, would they be successful to build a new alternative against the populist government, populist regime happening in Pakistan, Turkey, America, and most of the part of the Europe?
Well, the demands of these movements are very different. From what I gather, the main demand of the movement here was for the right to have students' unions again. Am I correct? Yeah. That's such a modest demand. I mean, obviously I agree with it, but it's such a modest demand that I'm amazed anyone could not grant that. I mean, in most countries of the world, students' unions have the right to exist. And here these rights were taken away during the dictatorships, especially during General Zia's dictatorship, when the Jamaat-e-Islami Students' League was more or less given official government support, and armed units of the IGT existed on all our campuses here. And that the sort of, we still have remnants of that, and it's basically, it's unacceptable, really. So, yeah, but the demands in India, for instance, at the moment, this big movement that has erupted, are in favor of the minorities, which extremely important and very, very strong movement, but will it win? We don't know. I mean, you know, one big problem in India has been that the Congress is totally dependent on one family. And as we know from our own history, it's not always a good thing. You know, whichever party it is, opposition or government party, to be completely dependent on one family is taking us backwards, not forwards. And the lots of people are now aware of this in the Congress. So I'm a bit despondent at the ability of an Indian political opposition to arise and challenge Modi. I hope they will, because it would be a great relief when the Modi government is defeated electorally, politically in the next election, so we should see. But then Chile, of course, it's a completely different thing. The students there were demanding a totally new constitution for the country and an end to all the remnants of the laws kept in place by the dictator Pinochet. So, yeah, I mean, most of them are eminently supportable, is my answer. But whether they'll succeed is a different thing.
One last question.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question in reference to this book, Protocol of the Learning Elders of the Zion. Protocol of the Elders of the Zion, written by a British who was living in Russia in 1920s. And what he wrote is exactly the same is happening right now in the world. And then when it comes to Zions, they are reclaiming their land of Babylon, which was like 560 BC. The whole Middle East is a part of that. So it refers to all that bloodlines and this war of bloodline, like these dragons, Draco bloodline, which is Rh negative, versus rest of the humanity, which is Rh positive. Do you have to anything to comment on that, or if you?
Yeah, I'm not normally asked a question like that at a public meeting. So that once again the originality of Lahore comes up, though not in a very nice way. I mean, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was an invention. It was an appalling book, an anti-Semitic tract, which was denounced by almost everyone at the time and subsequently. And I don't take such a document seriously. And honestly, I don't want to end on a sour note, but if you have taken it seriously, I would recommend counter-treatment. The fact is that the Israelis are now going mad. Anyone who criticizes Zionism and anti-Semite, that's unacceptable. And that's a very deliberate plan which the Israeli Foreign Office concocted after the Second Intifada to drive away any solidarity with the Palestinians. And it's been relatively successful in some parts of the world. But in order to understand real anti-Semitism when it existed, the Israelis never did anything then. I mean, I don't know how many people know that in the early first half of the last century, after the Second World War, when the British Empire handed over Saudi Arabia to the Al Saud family and their religious backers, the first king Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, any Western head of state who visited Saudi Arabia, as a gift from the king was handed a copy, specially bound, of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Not a single Western head of state, American presidents, British prime ministers, French presidents, ever said no. Today, if that were to be done, there would be an outcry, and rightly so, but at that time it was just accepted as something the king does. But it's, to come back to you, I wouldn't have anything to do with books like that. They don't even educate in a negative way. They're utterly useless. So move on.